Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this event looking at the future of official development assistance, ODA. Well, I'm really excited about this. We're going to have a great panel whom I will introduce shortly. I also want to refer you to a document, a compendium on the future of official development assistance that we at CGD launched last week, and you should be able to access it on our website. It's the future of ODA, incremental improvements or radical reform. And in a way, that is also the theme, if you like, of this conversation that we're going to have going forward. I want to say a word about what motivated us to put together this compendium and to launch this body of work. And the main reason is that we've all been working on official development assistance and watching the challenges that this concept faces as countries that provide ODA have tried to meet many different objectives, some of them traditional development focused, poverty reduction, new challenges like climate, like global public goods more broadly, trying to link it to their economic security. So that concept of ODA has become quite stretched. As you know, in many countries, there's a lot of criticism of the fact that significant amount of ODA is now spent on hosting refugees and asylum seekers in the donor country itself. So there's a credibility issue, there is a crisis of purpose, and we thought that this was a moment to try and get into these questions and ask ourselves, how can we move forward in a way that restores some of that trust and credibility, that preserves some of the initial focus on poverty reduction, on supporting development, and that also does so in a way that builds broader public support for ODA. That was the thinking behind this compendium, which we have put together. And today we have the privilege of having two of our panelists were contributors to this compendium. And I'm going to call on them first to lay out a little bit their thinking of how they think we should move forward. Susanna Gable, who is Deputy Director of Development Policy and Finance at the Gates Foundation, and she, along with Kalpana Kochar, contributed an important piece to the compendium. And then Pierre Jacquet. Pierre, of course, is well, we like to start off by saying that he's a non-resident fellow at CGT, but Pierre has many hats and has played a role in both international and French development policy. Pierre is also a key author for one of the concepts in the compendium, but actually he along with my colleague Rachel Calais and myself, were responsible for pulling together the compendium. So I'll call on Pierre next. Then we have two panelists who are going to look at it from the perspective of policymakers. Anton de Garcia is the director of the Spanish International Development Agency, and of course, Anton will be hosting, Spain will be hosting the FFD, the Finance for Development, in June this year. And in fact, it was the timing of the Finance for Development conference, which only happens once every 10 years, that was an added impetus for us to get this compendium out as an input into the thinking that will go into looking at the broader issues of financing for development. And finally, we have Kathy Nicolau Maneas, who is very firmly inside the finance track in the South African Ministry of Finance and looking at a whole set of issues that inheriting the presidency of the G20 means taking on a whole range of activities and responsibilities. But within that, of course, the development work is very important. And I want to get from both Anton and Kathy a perspective from both the donor country and representation right now of the global south is um, of how they see the challenges around official development assistance, but also what do they see as the practical, politically feasible pathways for making progress on these issues. Then we'll open it up. We have quite a few people who are online today. I know that something like 1,400 people have registered to join this call. Even a fraction of them will probably be alive. The others will watch it later. But if you are online, I encourage you to send in your questions. We'll make sure we have enough time to address some of the questions and points that you want to put. If you're watching this on the CGD website, you'll be able to see at the bottom a link that will enable you to ask questions. They'll come back to us. We will get to them. So without further ado, I want to turn first to Susanna and say, Susanna, you were basically, you and Kalpana, as I said, have put forward an issue and a proposal for a broader definition of development finance. Can you tell us a little bit how you see that working? How do you see that addressing some of the challenges that we currently face with ODA?
Well, thank you so much, Masood and Center for Global Development for organizing this event and for in general creating an idea space when we so badly need it. It's really crowdsourcing ideas that when it comes to the future of ODA, that's so important. And that remembering that every idea put on the table is really just addressing one aspect, including the framework that we are presenting. It's an angle on this problem that we think should just get a bit more in the limelight. So as everyone else, we start with the problem of we need to address all these global challenges that we have in front of us. We don't have the luxury to ignoring one, but ODA is not enough. So I'll make 5 quick points that I hope describe the main principles coming out from our framework. So the first one is that the future of ODA cannot be discussed without putting it in the context of the broader development finance landscape. In the end, in our chapter, we stress the need to safeguard the unique role of ODA for country-level development goals and poverty reduction, what it was meant for from the beginning. ODA is minuscule in contrast to the global challenges that we face, but at the same time, incredibly valuable for some countries and some issues. So when considering ODA separately to address all the goals, ODA becomes extremely diluted, inefficient, and ineffective. And it, not only ODA for that matter, other financing flows too. We have the same problem with private financing. We consider private financing separately. We try to max it out everywhere and for everything, rather than thinking through where can it make most difference. So given the urgency of the challenges we have in front of us, such as poverty reduction and climate change and so on, we cannot afford such siloed approach. First point being then to protect ODA for its original intent, we do need to have an idea on how we finance other challenges such as climate change. The second point is we do need to urgently solve a range of interlinked global challenges, But we argue that that doesn't translate into all countries addressing all issues with the same urgency. So we want to get as much done as soon as possible at the aggregate, given the urgency of global poverty and climate change, as mentioned. So we argue that to achieve all this in time, each country should primarily focus on their most burning needs and the global goal where they can actually make a difference. So the discussion in the chapter is not framed as either or in terms of development and climate at the global level, but we do recognize that at the country level, there are trade-offs. And I don't know if I can very grossly simplify, but poverty reduction in a high-income country is not very effective for the global goal of eradicating poverty, while mitigation policies in high-income countries are very effective for the goal of preventing climate change, and vice versa for a low-income country. And then you have all the different versions in between, of course. And all this needs to come with a lot of caveats. We know that all countries are transitioning towards a sustainable growth model, but we argue that you do that through very different paths and with very different levels of urgency. We can come back to potential energy path dependencies and exceptions needed in larger countries and so on. But our analysis in the report that the chapter is based on, it shows that more often than not, the priorities coming out when looking at it from a country perspective is very much aligned with where that country can contribute most in a certain for a certain global goal that we have set up. Third point, we need to pay more attention to the efficiency and effectiveness when allocating the financing we have. There's a huge resistance to talk about priorities and trade-offs. It's not fun. But then with the argument that let's not get distracted, let's focus on raising money, leverage as much as possible so that we can do everything at the same time and with some urgency. The light went off here. Let's see, there you go. And in the paper and the chapter, we do stress this also, that we need more resources. We also stress that we need more innovation, making each unit of progress cheaper, so to speak. But we argue that it needs to be combined with much higher consideration of allocation efficiency. So we do need to dare talk about priorities. We simply can't afford being wasteful with the financing we have when time is limited and challenges are so urgent. We basically need to use every penny in the most impactful way. So that brings me to the fourth point. We need then to ensure that each financing flow is put to use where it can make the biggest contribution. So in the same way as countries need to focus where they can make the biggest contribution, each financing flow needs to be matched then with the problem and the context where the financing flow and the financing instrument can actually be effective. We can't take every single type of financing flow and instrument and try to use it everywhere for everything. And different types of investments need to be matched with different parts of this capital stack including ODA, of course, that we're talking about today. So again, grossly simplifying, you would have ODA, or grants and highly concessional loans, the scarcest form of capital, directed towards the most acute development and adaptation needs in mostly lower income countries or lower middle income countries, where access to other types of financing is very limited. And then you would have private capital and that should be prioritized for, say, mitigation efforts or energy transformation in countries where that has a lower risk profile and where viable revenue streams are possible. Or, of course, where we think that mobilizing private capital can have a market creation effect, or build institutions and have a demonstration effect and so on in lower income countries. The fifth point is kind of wrapping up what I just said, that the importance of starting from the perspective of the country. It's to ensure that we focus on priority actions and ensure that we get the right mix of capital to ensure we use every penny all the way as efficiently as possible. But it's also the fact that we now talk about a broad set of global challenges. We cannot have structures or framework where you can't see all countries being represented in the framework. It needs to show clearly that all countries contribute, but they contribute in their way to this global agenda that we all care about. So in sum, the solution in our opinion is not to twist and stretch ODA into the new reality we live in, but to create a new development financing framework that fits the new reality, and then identify the unique comparative advantage that ODA plays within that broader framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. That was very comprehensive. And I think your last sentence sort of summed it up. It's to recognize that there are many different legitimate reasons why you need to spend public money. Different countries will need to focus on targeting the global goal where their own action has the biggest impact, and the right mix of instruments, financial instruments, needs to be deployed. Within that, there needs to be a clear role for ODA, which needs to be focused, as you said, on poverty and development, but there needs to be financing identified for the other challenges as well, because they are important challenges that we can't afford to ignore. And I think all that actually resonates well with Pierre. I'm going to turn to you next. You and Rachel Kaleha and myself in the first chapter of the compendium put forward an approach which more explicitly recognizes that there are different goals and proposes a tiered approach. Do you want to give us a quick overview of that, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Masoud, and it's been a pleasure to take part in this joint exercise, and of course I hope that it will feed into the forthcoming debates on the future of ODA. As you said, Masoud, and as Susanna said, it's perfectly normal and legitimate to have many objectives. So where does the problem come from? It comes from the fact that all these objectives are pursued within the same limited and constrained pot of money. And on top of that, there are some short-term objectives and longer-term ones. And the difficulty is that the short-term urgencies always drive the list of priorities. So in a way, this pot of money is used for short-term urgencies, and the long-term objectives are underserved. So what we did in thinking about this is to summarize these objectives into three categories. One is a traditional objective of ODA, growth and poverty reduction. The second one is humanitarian and responses to crisis, and this is actually one of the very short-term urgencies that drive money, crowd out other objectives of global international funding. And the third one is global public goods, and that includes fight against climate change, adaptation, and biodiversity protection. So we have, again, one pot of budget for all, and short-term objectives and urgencies drive out the longer-term one. So what we thought was, and it's very much compatible with what Susanna proposed, is to ring-fence this objective with a specific organization for each of them. And the idea is that for each objective, we should have a vision of the relevant activities. How do we measure their effectiveness and efficiency? What are the methods that are appropriate? And for that, we need some management organization. And what we propose is a committee of experts reporting to a global structure. That could be the G20, it could be the United Nations. That needs to be, of course, discussed. And the task of the committee would be to provide technical guidance and mainly to act as a depository of individual countries' commitments and activities. So we would think that individual countries would set their own targets. So there is no sense of a global normative approach to it. So it's a kind of soft accountability framework to monitor what countries are doing along each of these category of objectives. Why do we think that it's a path forward? Well, first of all, as you could note, it's a very modest approach. It recognizes the diversity. It recognizes the fact that we may have different objectives. It is compatible with grand visions. That is, in a while, we could imagine that we move to a world in which there is a global public policy that will include all this in a coherent way. We are not there yet, and it's certainly not feasible right now. But this is a first step towards something that can be better organized. And of course, it is compatible with today's troubled geopolitical environment because it doesn't require any ideological convergence. It's a very pragmatic step that recognizes that each country in the world has legitimate interest in spending money abroad and tries to organize these different interests in different lines. And while doing so, to preserve a line that has been working quite well, actually, but unfortunately with a budget that is too limited, which is ODA. And we need to be very careful, but not threatening that objective of growth and poverty reduction in the least developed and middle-income countries. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pierre. So as you say, there's actually quite a lot of compatibility and common approaches between what Susanna laid out and what you've laid out. You said something which is important just to remind ourselves that this is really you use the term a modest approach because it starts from the reality of how people are spending money now under the different rubrics of ODA and sometimes not ODA to address issues beyond their own borders. And we have to recognize that what people are doing reflects their real preference, but also the reality of the challenges that countries face. And so this is a way of codifying that, but also then being clear about effectiveness and impact in each of those areas so that the results can be measured against the objective for which the money was being spent, rather than pretending that all the money is being spent to deliver development and poverty reduction when it has many purposes, and clearly then being a little bit hamstrung in how to measure impact and effectiveness. Anton, I will come to you now, please, if I may. You've heard these two approaches. We had a similar conversation last week that you were also party to, where we had a range of ideas put on the table. How do you see this conversation moving forward? You are one of the key policymakers who will have to adopt some ideas for your own work and advance these ideas with your peers in the international debate. How do you see this moving ahead?
Well, thank you, Masood, and thank you for this timely conversation. It's strange I need to do this, but I think it is still important. I don't think there has been a moment in history where ODA, global solidarity, investment in global public goods, but also in poverty and inequalities has been so important as it is now. We are reaching planetary limits. If we look at the climate crisis, we are seeing poverty reduction proceeding at a much slower pace than before the pandemic. We are seeing hunger in many parts of the world. We are seeing 120 active conflicts everywhere. So we do need, we can call it ODA, we can reform it deeply, we can call it something else. We do need to act together on common challenges. There is a poly crisis, and the last crisis, the one that we can really not afford, is a crisis of trust, a trust between North and South, between different countries on tackling all these global commons. Now, if you ask me the question, and I think that's the question that both Pierre and Susanna are trying to answer, is the system we have all been working since the 70s fit for purpose? I would say clearly not. And I'm a user of that system. I think the system has been stretched, and Pierre has mentioned this, in partially, and I think it's important also to recognize this, is a testimony of the success of ODA. We had a collection of problems, new problems popping up, conflicts, climate. We look at poverty and growth, but then we realize inequalities are important, how we distribute the cake, then we add inequalities. And we had one measurement, we had one source of funding that was ODA. And we try to use ODA to tackle every single problem the world has. And I think that's perhaps now the moment to look at it and start to really see what ODA can do best. And that, I think, is Susanna's point, is where can ODA provide the biggest bang for the buck, and where we need other flows that, by the way, and this is important as well, they need to be additional. So if I had to say, I like the ideas thrown on the table by Susanna and Pierre. We'll see how feasible it is to implement them in the coming months, because Pierre was saying it's not really, you don't need political convergence. Well, the issue is that there are a number of political actors that are questioning global solidarity altogether, and that's important to keep in mind. So what we need ODA and beyond. So we need flows additional to ODA. I very much like the idea of really looking at the full picture of financing for development. That's what we all together will be doing in Seville in a few months. The ODA chapter, I tell my colleagues, is actually the most boring one, because we have 0.7, we have a few elements and some others that a number of us would still like to see on the statement and to push. But let's look at domestic resource mobilization, let's look at trade, let's look at innovation. And by the way, these other flows can be facilitated by ODA as well. So we need ODA and beyond, and we need to reform ODA or see incremental changes probably. I would be more leaning towards incremental changes, at least for now, and we need to reform the beyond as well. So on ODA, the governance needs to evolve a bit. The DAC is talking to other partners. We need to make the system much more inclusive. One of the flaws of the system, or the limitations, is that it is made on the perspective of the donors. Well, news for everyone, development cooperation is no longer a vertical relationship between North and South. I say it, we say it often, it is less about aid, more about partnership. So we need to engage others. We have done so, actually, facilitated by Spain. We had a meeting in Madrid between OECD DAC and LAC countries, middle-income countries that had, and by the way, we sense convergence in the room, I have to say. Second, we need to look at the rules. Graduation, does it make sense? Does it make sense to have a system where countries move in a lockstep system, or isn't development a much more linear and sometimes with ups and downs process? we need to look at the buckets. That's Pierre's idea, and it is true. We are doing at least 3 things with ODA. And I would say we need to certainly cover with ODA bucket 1 and bucket 2, growth, poverty, inequalities, like the core solidarity element. I think ODA makes sense also for the crisis response, certainly. And when it comes to the global public goods, we can smartly use ODA, but we need additional flows too. So if you look at climate adaptation and resilience, I am very happy financing that. And actually in Spain, we are investing heavily on that because that's actually what our partner countries want. When it comes to mitigation, is there a strong argument to do mitigation from development agencies using ODA for mitigation? Yes, but the case is a bit dimmer if I have Susanna's argument. And I think there we can look into additional flows. We can look into some other element of global public goods, and we are actually in Spain also committed to increasing our climate finance, not just through ODA. And I think we need to look at the quality too. For very long, we've been obsessed with increasing the amounts, and that has come at the expense of integrity and the quality of ODA. Measuring, and we are doing it, CPA, country programmable aid, is also important to see how well we are doing. I also tell colleagues often here in the public, in interviews and so on, we need to do more, but we need to do better as well. Let's don't be, just defensive. We need to improve. We need to actually see where our investments give the biggest payoff, protecting our planet, protecting people, promoting prosperity. And I think we need to fix also broader finance. We need to look at much more. Actually, in Addis, we talk about the country platforms and the possibility and the idea of integrating the different flows, by the way, including domestic resource mobilization. Another key priority that we are using in our middle-income countries, our partners in Latin America, investing much more on fiscal systems. That's also financing for development. But beyond the reforms, Masoud, I think what we need is a new narrative, frankly. And that narrative is emerging. I hope to see it somehow reflected in Seville. But this is the language that people in the north and in the south, my partners whom I visit when I travel and I listen to, because we need to listen much more, this is no longer about aid, it is much more about investment. That's the key word that I hear from countries in the global south. It is more about mutual interest, treating each other like adults and seeing where the commonalities, the common interest between development agencies and our partner countries merge. So we need, don't misinterpret me, but we need more of a logic of aid. We need aid, we need more than what we have, and we are increasing in Spain, but we need the logic, less a logic of aid, more a logic of partnership. So that's actually what we are doing in Spain domestically. We are reforming our system. We adopted a new law that commits us to 0.7 because we do need to get to 0.7 because we need additional, call it ODA, call it global solidarity, because take climate. We have common but differentiated responsibilities. And I do think there is a number of countries, in this case, the DAC donors and the DAC members, which I hope one day get bigger. There are more people knocking at the door of the DAC. That's an important one, that have a special responsibility on tackling some of these challenges that we've been mentioning. But if I look at the reform of my agency, we are now reforming the agency, like we are strengthening our financial arm. We are mostly a grant-making agency. We need to go from the million, in our case, I would say the billions to the trillions. In our case, from the millions to the billions, but we need to get bigger. So we are strengthening our financing arm, reimbursable aid, reversible cooperation. We are strengthening our humanitarian assistance. We have tripled it over the last few years, I think 3 years, because these crises are becoming more and more, and we need to stop diverting resources from looking at the longer-term perspective. We are strengthening our sectoral and knowledge basis, because we need to be at the COPs. My predecessors did not go to climate COPs. I've been to the last 3 of them. And we need partnerships. We are strengthening our partnership. We need to work less in our own projects and much more on mobilizing others and bringing different actors on the table. So we are doing 0.7, but we are going beyond. And we are saying we will continue cooperating with upper middle-income countries and high-income countries on some elements of the agenda. And we hope to continue using a development cooperation mindset in tackling some of these global challenges beyond graduation. which, by the way, harms particularly those LDCs that graduate into middle income status. Again, this is a key topic for us and for many of our partner countries. We need new instruments. Yesterday only we launched this year's our call for proposals for our program on triangular cooperation. That's also development cooperation. Again, it's not just the North and South dimension. And also, in terms of what we focus, we adopted a new strategy for the next 4 years, where Spain is going to focus on the triple transition. And I think that goes to Susana's point about the transition. I would be a bit cautious to make a clear distinction between poverty and climate, because we need to support our countries in the same transition that we are tackling at home. We need to transform our economies to decarbonize. We need to bring everybody along. So there is an ecological transition, there is a social transition, and there is also an economic transition to bring prosperity for everyone. So within that mix, we need to see, as Susana and Pierre were making this argument, see where we can do better and we can invest our valuable resources, in this case ODA, in the smartest way possible. So again, I do think we need to reform ourselves. We need a reform of ODA. I suspect that given geopolitical challenges, not because of the system and not because both recipients and development partners do not want, because we all, I think, agree that the system needs change. But I think the pace at which we can proceed is probably going to be incremental rather than transformational, at least for the next coming months. But Seville is not the end of anything. Sevilla can be actually the beginning of many, many points, including an ambitious reform of financing for development and ODA as part of it.
Thank you very much, Anton. I think I took your last point that in the next few months, maybe a bit slower going, incremental. And I take the point that, we have to link this to the geopolitical context. And I should just say that in the chat that Star has just forwarded to me, there are a number of questions. And a lot of people who are watching this are saying, asking questions about the implications of what's happening in terms of the freeze on US development programs, the future of USAID is a little uncertain. And they're asking, well, how will your organizations react to that? Do you have any comments on that? Now, obviously, this is not a session about that, but if any of you want to react to any of those questions, I leave that open for the second round. Just to recognize that the United States is the largest provider of development assistance, and about a quarter of total development assistance, more than a quarter of humanitarian assistance. So obviously, whatever decisions that are made about the US's development programs, both in terms of the cash flow impact of a freeze, but also longer-term impact of whatever comes out of their review, will be consequential for the system as a whole, simply by virtue of its size. But I just wanted to alert you that there are those questions. Before we come to the questions, though, I want to come to Kathy. Kathy, you're, as I said, G20, South Africa, looking at this also from how to ensure that the perspective of African countries, the continent, reflected in the priorities. ODA is still quite important for a number of countries on the continent, less so for other middle-income countries that can access other forms of finance, but for many low-income countries, it still remains a big source of external finance on terms that they can afford. What's your reaction to listening to all this? How does it resonate with you?
Thanks so much, Masood. So, to your point about the US, I was actually talking to a colleague this morning, and he's telling me that they receive a lot of USAID funding. They are now having daily meetings to actually see how they're going to sort of protect the jobs of the individuals that are actually working, particularly on HIV and AIDS and health-related issues in South Africa. And I've seen this from a couple of institutions. We've seen some of the universities having to have massive freezes, which impacts on people's lives directly. So I think it's a huge issue and something we need to think about. As we were talking a little earlier before this session started, it was quite interesting that we are going to have a very interesting G20 this year, 2025, particularly as the US is one of the key Troika partners, and next year is going to be even more interesting as the US takes the lead in the G20. And so, I mean, I think just to sort of frame how that's going to be a very interesting space where, you know, a lot of work has been done in the tax and the domestic resource mobilization space. And it looks like a lot of whatever has been announced in the space with the US has actually gone backwards. But anyway, so I think in terms of ODA, and I'm going to really sort of talk to 5 or 6 key points, and then I'm also going to give you a sense of what we're focusing on specifically and how ODA is critical for that. So I think the first thing is, if we think about ODA and its traditional sort of poverty alleviation, you know, hunger, inequality, and possibly growth, I think you start to traipse into a very muddy space because these things don't fit in very discrete buckets. And I think that's where the complexity actually comes in. And that's why the financing for development is actually quite an important part, because where I sit, I mean, I oversee work on illicit financial flows linked to domestic resource mobilization specifically. And this is, if you can address domestic resource mobilization, you can increase the tax and the capability of developing countries to raise tax revenues. And as a result, also be able to track, trace, and stem illicit financial flows. They would actually be less dependent on overseas development, on official development assistance. And I think that's an important point to remember. So that, and ODA, so while illicit financial flows then limit the ability for countries to address a lot of their own poverty, inequality, social protection, roads, infrastructure, health, etc., I mean, we can't think about it exclusively as, you know, just addressing some of the social protection issues that link to poverty specifically. Linked to that is an important point that on the African continent, for every $1.2 of illicit financial flows leaving the continent, we receive $1 of ODA. And so the reality is, if we could strengthen the ability to address illicit financial flows and increase domestic resource mobilization, the likelihood that we were as dependent on ODA would actually decrease. So the reality is we need to use ODA to a large extent to try and strengthen that capacity and capability in developing countries, which is addressing their ability to strengthen their tax authorities, to strengthen their customs authorities, their central banks, their financial intelligence agencies, their law enforcement authorities, their ability to prosecute, not only just investigate, but prosecute. A lot of countries are being grey listed because of their inability to actually prosecute and recoup. And then finally, we've got to think about, you know, the recovery of stolen assets at the end of that entire value chain. So I think these are important issues that we need to keep in mind. If we start thinking about ODA, and it was mentioned by Anton, this isn't just about, you know, ODA to try and strengthen economies in the global south, but it's really about giving them the tools so that they can actually strengthen themselves, build their institutions where there are weak institutions, address the debt that's going there, address all of the issues that climate finance is a huge issue, so that if we can address economic growth, to a large extent, these countries can start becoming less dependent on ODA and actually contribute to a growing global world at the end of the day. And I think that's quite an important thing. And I think that is quite an important issue that is being raised by the finance track in the G20, is to say, while the cost of capital is very important and debt is a huge issue, and it's quite a contentious issue, particularly where we think about resource-backed loans, which are basically taking the loans are based on whatever extractives or valuable resources are at a particular country. And we see some very irresponsible behavior, for example, where about 95% of some countries' GDP, and this is actually being used to basically just service the debts on resource-backed loans. So, I mean, these are things that should be criminal and not really allowed. And to some extent, ODA allows for more responsible use and access to finance versus these resource-backed, or what we call asset-backed loans. I think it's important to note that we need to start working together, and it starts talking to the points of Pierre and Anton. You know, we need to, while it's important to build innovative capacity in developing countries, we need to see how we can actually strengthen cooperation, collaboration, etc., building communities of practice, learning from each other. Very often work is being done in one country. We never learn from what's being done there. We don't understand what the lessons are, and we just continue running a similar program, not really leveraging what was learned in another country, which is very context specific, but there are lessons to be learned. And so we see a huge amount of what I call donor fatigue, where a lot of money is being leveled at countries, and particularly when we look at illicit financial flows, money laundering, terror financing, etc., domestic resource mobilization. But if that ODA was actually more coordinated, it would actually ensure that these resources, which are hugely scarce, could actually be leveraged better. And I think that's quite an important thing. So thinking about how we can do that better, I think is important. In terms of what we're focusing on as the development working group, obviously global public goods is a big issue. We were joking as to whether we should include illicit financial flows and domestic resource mobilization as a global public good. And in the group, everybody was like, no, we've got enough issues under the GPG agenda. Can we stick to what should be in the GPG agenda? And what happens is the bigger we make the GPG agenda, the less likely we are to achieve anything. And so trying to keep it small and concrete, I think, is important. On the second issue is obviously on financing for development, and in that raising issues around domestic resource mobilization, illicit financial flows, and strengthening the capacity, particularly on the trade side. And there it is about strengthening customs capacity, in ensuring that we can actually better collect data so that we can better measure illicit financial flows and that we can better intercept it and track it, etc. So there's quite a bit around that, and it's not just around traded goods, but it's also about services that are currently traded. And then my last point is really around social protection and introducing universal social protection. So that's essentially what we're focusing on. Over to you, Masood. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for that. And thank you also for giving us a bit of an overview of what you're focusing on as part of the development working group in the G20. There's a question that comes through in a number of the interventions that people have sent online. And it's really about how we make progress. What they're saying is, look, there are a number of issues that you put on the table. You're talking about how to finance GPGs. You're talking about how to account for ODA. You're talking about how to develop a new narrative, talking about impact and effectiveness. This is a very big agenda. And what's in terms of priorities or in terms of focus over the next few months, given the context in particular, the political, geopolitical, and national political context that you referred to, given the priorities in the G20, lots of issues that we need to make progress on, what do you think is the most promising way to start to make progress? And, maybe, Suzanne, I'll come back to you. What's your sense, and you're thinking about these issues very much in the Gates Foundation, between now and the end of this year, and between now and FFD in the middle of the year? How do we most productively take this conversation forward?
Well, I think the FFD process that we are in right now is incredibly important. And Anton was referring to the ODA chapter as the most boring one, but I think that might have been the case during the Addis version. But I think this time around it will be one of the most interesting ones, and maybe the hardest one to write. But I think we need to get as concrete as possible as to paths forward, but also recognize that we are right in the middle of a historic paradigm shift when it comes to development cooperation and development finance. So the FFD process is also incredibly important to just create a platform where all the ideas, the concerns, ensuring that trust that we talked about can't be broken, trust for multilateral institutions, can come to surface. And what the FFD process can do is to ensure that is not that it comes in an organized fashion and can pinpoint what are the big questions we need to agree on, and then we'll see if we can do it in the FFD process. If not, have a path forward, be that some sort of implementation commission or expert commission, or what have you, or that just some countries raise their hands and are ready to take leadership and come with some concrete actions. Whatever solution is not gonna be perfect for everyone, but I think it's key to talk about ODA in this broader FFD context, so that just because you say you want to safeguard ODA for poverty reduction, it does not mean that we should not work on other financing flows for poverty reduction and ensure that we achieve also climate change and all of those things. Yeah.
Thank you. I think your last sentence is really important, that you need to be clear in any narrative that just because you want to safeguard ODA for its traditional purposes, it doesn't mean that you are indifferent to or not supportive of the need to find adequate financing to deal with shared global challenges. It's just that these are different things, and we need to make sure they're adequately financed on their own terms. Pierre, prioritization from your point of view, what should we be focusing on for the next few months?
Well, let me propose a different perspective on this, and this is a perspective that comes with the privilege of age. It is true that we are in a situation in which there are many new approaches and new issues and so on, but at the same time, many of the questions that we are discussing were questions that we were already playing with 20, 30 years ago. And that leads to a question, which is, why hasn't it worked better? And when I look at this, I have the impression that there are three main reasons. One is unmet commitments. We spend a lot of time meeting together and promising to solve these issues with money, with approaches and so on, and that never happened. And these unmet commitments lead to a loss of credibility, basically, and loss of trust. The second reason is lack of inclusiveness. And it was mentioned already, the perspective of ODA has been a perspective of donor countries, much more than a perspective from recipient countries. And the third reason is a lack, and it's linked to that, is a lack of ownership. We are going to countries and explaining to them how they should develop. Well, I think this should be back to country-led perspectives, and we should spend a lot of time and resources to make that actually happen. So my priorities would be to adopt an approach in the coming months which is serious along these three dimensions: commitments, inclusiveness, and ownership. We shouldn't overpromise, especially in the current geopolitical situation, because it's simply not credible. And frankly, when I read the draft report of the FFD, and I think, as it was said, it's a crucial event that's going to take place in 2025. But there are many promises. The world is nice, you know. We are going to do whatever is needed to make the world function better. This is simply not credible. We need to find priorities. We need to focus on how this is going to be implemented. And that, for me, would be a major priority.
We need to make serious commitments. When we make commitments, we need to be serious, more inclusive, and more ownership in terms of country priorities driving what it is that we finance. Now, Anton, so you heard Pierre give you his three-part package. And I want to ask you, given where the politics in donor countries now stand, seriousness about commitments, fair enough, that we would have, more intrusiveness in terms of having a broader group of countries be part of that conversation, and the priorities need to be the priorities of the partner countries, but many donors now have very clear priorities. If you look at the EU program, they're very clearly relating that what the EU finances to the EU's own strategic objectives, and I can see that in many national programs. To what extent are the three parts of their solution, if you like, or package to help address these questions, things that you think we can move ahead with, which is more feasible than the other, or any other thoughts?
Look, I broadly agree with the diagnosis that Pierre has done on the three problems and the challenges we have. The question is, what is realistically, what sort of prescription we can give to our patient for the coming months? And I think there are a few things we can do. First one, and I think there is an opportunity looking at the international media, the turmoil in the US, I think there is an opportunity there as well to revisit the question of the narrative. And narrative is not just communication, it's what is development cooperation today? Why is it important? Why is it important not just for global solidarity? In Spain, we are lucky that 80% of our public opinion is behind us. That's not the same numbers everywhere. But development cooperation has always been, continues to be, and will continue to be soft power for our countries. Spain wants to be more or less, according to our weight in the global economy, as a country, we want to influence global debates. And development cooperation is part of this. And I think we need to together try to make the case that the development cooperation, that ODA, is a smart investment. And it's a smart investment to tackle the global problems, but also to tackle the problems of that concrete, the particular citizens, our citizens in the global north also have back at home. Migration flows, climate crisis, and this is indeed part of our interests, is part of our values, and the values are important, and we need to stick to those, but it's also part of our interests. Let's throw that, and countries in the global south are ready for that. What they've been looking for actually is a serious conversation between adults and values. So I would say, number one, narrative. The second, even if we don't manage in Seville to coalesce around a language that says this, we cannot change the how we do development cooperation. Let's listen more. It takes two, and Pierre was mentioning, lack of ownership, over-promising and under-delivering, all that is there. Let's just engage truly, meaningfully with the other side. Let's see what people across the side want. It has never worked. Development needs to be an endogenous process in, let's say, the recipient countries. It has never worked when it has been imposed, when it's been solutions that have been devised in universities in the north. Triangular cooperation, I mentioned it before, some of the knowledge that global south countries need to chart their own path to development, it is also in the global south. There is a lot of south-to-south cooperation. We are promoting triangular cooperation. There is a lot out there. Three, I would say, in the coming months, for Seville and beyond Seville, identify a program of work. And I think the discussion we're having today is part of that, is what realistically can we do? What are the areas? And frankly, I think on the diagnosis, there is a lot of convergence. On the solutions, we can see, and we will see what's the path of least resistance to bring about change. I'm skeptical of big groups of countries with different political ideologies. I am part of a government that has a very clear stance on these issues. There are governments across the aisle on the complete extreme. By the way, some that are increasing development cooperation for reasons completely different to my own government, but they are increasing it. So let's have those conversations. Frankly, there are a number of points in the agenda where I think we can find common agreement. And fourth, let's get the job done. And we are practical people, those of us working in development. Addis is a great document. I read it on my way to UN General Assembly for the Pact of the Future. The document is still, there is maybe the climate discussion that was still not there. It's a great document. The problem where we have collectively fallen short, all of us, is on implementation. So let's make sure that whatever we agree on Seville, it's we focus on implementation, because that is very important to regain trust with the citizens in the north and in the south, and among countries and in the multilateral system. Trust, I think, is key.
So I think you both said focus on implementation, and that's what's going to help to rebuild trust. And I think there's a legitimate question that people will debate, which is to say, when you have these Back to the Future or FFD documents, they have to be aspirational to a degree. They have to set a vision of where the world could be. They can't simply be starting from the lowest common denominator and simply reflecting where we are if we're not making progress. On the other hand, you have to balance that with their being aspirational but realistic in terms of providing a vision that people can actually relate to and say, yes, we can get there if we all come together. And so they have to be grounded also in the political reality of the time. And it's how do you at the same time keep your foot in the political reality while you still have your head in terms of providing a vision that is beyond where we are now. And that's obviously the challenge that they will have to work through between now and June in terms of the FFD document, and we'll see where it comes up. Kathy, I want to come to you to a point that was raised by Anton, which is the triangular or South-South cooperation. We've been talking about ODA, and the ODA, of course, is not just provided, although it's not necessarily called ODA by others, but it's not just provided by the DAC members. Now, development cooperation is something that goes far beyond the traditional DAC members. You have many countries that were receiving development assistance who are now providing development assistance. So Latin American countries, Asian countries, China, Middle East, India, they all have programs of development cooperation. South Africa has its own program with others. How do you see the conversations among South-South providers and participants in development cooperation as being resonating with what we have been talking about? And how does that relate to the G20 and also from your perspective, how can we try and blend a bit the conversations in between South-South and the more traditional DAC and related providers?
I mean, I think we have to almost like split the debate a little bit into two. The first is obviously that even though, so I think there are the needs of the global south, and they tend to be relatively similar, right? Not entirely, but I mean, issues of poverty, hunger, inequality, climate, odious debt is something that affects, developing countries in Africa as well as those in Latin America, and potentially some in Asia as well. So, I mean, I think this particular G20, South Africa is trying to ensure that the issues of the African continent are raised front and center, and that they're considered, but it's not just about the African continent, it is about the global south and how other developing countries are also affected by some of these big global issues that are starting to become essentially global public goods, right? I mean, climate is a issue that's going to affect all of us. It's not just something that affects developing countries, but how we respond to it and how we're affected by it is probably very different. So I think one is how the developing world, is experiencing a lot of these challenges, and there's obviously a fair amount of solidarity amongst in terms of South-South cooperation. A big thing that does happen, through South-South cooperation is also learning and capacity building, where we, try and create these alliances where we're actually learning and sharing from each other and building what I call these communities of practice, which are quite important in how we strengthen and leverage that. And then to a large extent, we obviously have, donors that are in Asia or China or in Latin America or in the Middle East, etc., that are providing support to a lot of developing countries. And I think there are challenges in terms of how a lot of that, comes through. All donor funding is comes with its own levels of complexity, how you report, what is expected to be done, etc. But I think the reality is that apart from some of our developing countries on the continent where China is a huge investor, on the continent, particularly if we're looking at sort of investment in infrastructure and how we're building, cross-border infrastructure on the continent, the DAC countries still remain sort of some of the Global South's primary donor provider at the end of the day. And I think there are issues around, and I think both Anton and Pierre have raised critical issues, which it is about the lack of ownership and commitment and inclusiveness, but ownership is a big thing. I see in a lot of the programs that, we come, I actually team lead an ODA funded program through the FCDO, and we're actually trailblazing through our budget. So we don't have an implementation problem at all, but it's because I'm a local expert that's highly networked and connected into sort of the different arms of government. So the Treasury, ADECO, the Department of Social Development, Trade, etc. And so that ability to be able to design programs that are needed by government are a lot easier than if an international expert, which is very typical of an EU-funded program, where they would prefer an EU expert coming in who doesn't have these networks and has to almost like start from scratch and try and build. Those partnerships become a lot more difficult. At the end of the day, partnerships are about relationship building and they are about people. I also think that in the context of development, one of the big things is the rigidity in which these log frames are structured, and I understand that we have to be accountable at the end of the day, but these softer rules have to come in. And so a lot of work has been done through sort of Harvard's problem-driven iterative adaptation, where we try and be more problem-driven, and we also use search frames, and there's complexity type monitoring and evaluation, where we always use the, are you designing a program that's going to be built by a mechanic, or development is more akin to a gardener that has to, tend a garden, and that the environment is very different. And so, the needs of a South Africa is very different to the needs of a Ghana or a Kenya or a Brazil, for example. And so ODA has to be customized in that regard. So over to you, Masood.
Kathy, thank you for raising those questions. We're going to be running out of time, but I want to get a quick reaction to what Kathy had just said. You could have had this conversation a decade ago, where people would be saying, look, if you're from the point of view of the country that's at the other side of a development partnership, that they're struggling with the rigidity, with the lock rates that have to be filled out. I would also add to that the fragmentation, the many funders who all have their own rules, and although at the aggregate level they talk about coordinating, when it comes down to each project, they've got a slightly different set of forms that have to be filled out. I wish you're still raising that with us. So, Susanna, you have moved from being in the Swedish development machine, SIDA, now you're in Gates Foundation. Do you think people are listening to this? Are we reacting on the donor side, reacting to and modifying the procedures, or what's holding them back? What's your reaction to listening to what Kathy just said?
I think it's very much related to when we keep putting more and more challenges to address within ODA, right? So sorry for going back a bit to the overall perspective, but I think it's important as a first step to also reach these type of problems is to be clear on when we talk about addressing national public goods, if you'd like. So what we try to achieve through ODA through times, right, with poverty reduction and country-specific development issues. And when we are addressing global public goods, and it comes back to the to the narrative point by Anton too, that we can then use all sorts of self-interest arguments for a global public investment bucket that goes to these global public goods. But in terms of the ODA, the self-interest is a secondary positive external effect, right? And we can talk a lot about this secondary effect, but the main purpose is country-owned, country-specific development issues. And then we would harmonize, we go back to the Paris Declaration basically, and harmonize around the countries again, and their priorities and their structures and their institutions. And by the way, a country development, just because that is the main focus, that does not dismiss mitigation efforts. We see that all over the place, right? That mitigation, climate and development issues are interrelated, but the main purpose is for development and poverty reduction in that bucket, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you. Anton, 2 minutes, quick reaction, last word.
Yeah, two things. First, we need to get better at what we do, and appropriation, fragmentation, ownership. Let's rescue the global, the effectiveness agenda. We forgot about it, and it's important. We need to get better at what we do. It's part of the narrative. It's also part of explaining to our own citizens where their valuable public resources go. And I somehow disagree a bit with Susanna. I think, true, in global public goods, we see the self-interest more evidently. But I do think that countries have an interest in investing also in poverty in lower income countries. Frankly, it's about soft power too. And also, let's be clear with our citizens. The reason why we have development agencies is because we want to be relevant in the global arena. We want to make friends across the board, and we invest in things that matter, maybe not immediately in our self-interest, but matter to others. And therefore, we build productive and constructive partnerships that go beyond development cooperation. Investment, trade, many other things.
Thank you. You know, we're running out of time, so I just want to say one thing, though. I understand and I appreciate that we have to make the case for development cooperation now by demonstrating how it is in our own interest, sometimes very near term, sometimes longer term, for all the reasons that you outlined. I continue to believe, and I think a lot of surveys show that to be the case, that sometimes people are worried that if you try to make the case in solidarity, there's nobody out there listening. But I am feeling actually in all our countries, rich countries, poor countries, there is still a strong vein of solidarity, where people want to help others, not only because it is in their self-interest, but also because it is the right thing to do. And to the extent that they have questions or concerns about the development cooperation program, is because they're not convinced that the way we do development cooperation is the most effective way of helping people. Maybe it's the machinery, maybe it's the institution, maybe it's the system. But I think we can get right down to it and say, look, do you think it's a good idea for us to be helping provide basic education and healthcare to girls in Afghanistan who are being denied this by their own government? I think you're going to get a lot more people saying, yes, we should do that, than we sometimes worry. So maybe I'm being idealistic on it, but I genuinely do believe that we shouldn't assume that there's no base of solidarity left. And I think that's still going to be, it's not the only reason why people provide development cooperation, for all the reasons that you've so eloquently outlined, but I think it is an important reason that we shouldn't ignore. We've run out of time. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us and lay out your perspective. Thank you also to all the people who joined in and sent in questions. There were quite a few questions about So the implications of you're saying, what we think about that we haven't really been able to answer those, I think partly because we don't really feel at this stage we have a very clear sense, or at least none of the panelists picked that up. But we try to address some of the other questions that came in. So thank you, everyone, and let me bring this to a close now.